My name is Ronny Charles. I'm a content producer. Um, yeah, and I like conversations.
Okay.
Sex to me is a lot of things. I would say first and foremost it's an avenue to communicate, to connect, because through sex you say a lot of things. Um, and it's a form of pleasure as well, although that might be at face value, but it's just as important. Um, and I think it's also sacred in many ways, yeah. Yeah, that's what it is to me.
Okay.
Yeah, I do remember both. I do remember my first encounter with sex. It wasn't great. I don't know, if I'm projecting, I would think maybe most people would say the same because you don't know what you're doing. Right? That was my first encounter. Um, the person was not necessarily anyone that I perhaps had feelings for. I think it was the idea of sex and the first time of it rather than the person. These are things that, as a young person, you can't really fathom at that point. You just figure it out later. My first encounter with sex was probably, I don't know, maybe hearing sounds across another room, like with adults or something. And then maybe after that, maybe a porn magazine or a DVD somebody left, like an uncle, an older brother, and it seems so foreign. Like it does these things to your body and you're like not sure what's happening. So it's like this intense thing that's thrust upon you, like, oh my God, what's going on? What's happening? And then you almost get into like trance state and you're trying to figure out because it's an exposure to something that you've never seen before, So yeah, that's what I would say my first encounter was like with it. So I'll keep the answer maybe a little bit high level. But I think over the years, if I can take it chronologically, over the years things have changed. At the beginning, it was sort of like a rite of passage. As a young man, you're always trying to emulate your peers. Not peers, but like, let's say, people that are one stage ahead of you because you want to grow, you want to be seen as an adult. So it's like a sort of rite of passage, and then you experience it and you're like, okay, I guess it's not what I thought because you knew nothing about it. And then at some point becomes just perhaps this pursuit of like pleasure when you're a little bit younger. And then the consequences start kicking in terms of like the impact that it has on the other person. It starts becoming more real than just an isolated scenario. So then you sort of like back away and then think again on how to reinterpret and approach sex. But I think now for me it's a little bit more of a, like, I think it goes back to my original answer, the first answer I gave. It's an important frame of communication with somebody that you really care about, and it's a sacred avenue to connect with someone. I think, yeah, that's how I perceive it. With a dash of pleasure as well, you can enjoy that, but you can look at sex in the moment, but then there's all the ramifications outside of it, or benefits as well. So when you look at it holistically, then you see it as a bigger thing. Absolutely. So I think, sex is definitely polarizing, depending to your cultural background, who you are, your experiences, and so many other things. But I think how you approach it has a lot to do with how you communicate around it and during it. So, so how do I frame this? Setting good expectations for sex with each other's partners is one thing that's important, in that, in my opinion, the good expectations are no expectations at all. Just come as you are and take it from there. Like, don't think of a preconceived idea of how it should be when you're having a sexual encounter with someone, particularly someone that you care about. That's the frame of reference in which I look at it. Outside of that, I think it can be very tricky. You know, there's a lot of unmarked territory, murky ground, questions. You know, if it's somebody where you don't have a proper avenue to communicate around it, then you can potentially face a lot of challenges because it's not clear what framework you guys are operating under. But if you can talk about it and be okay with everything as it is, it's like starting a project, you know. You have people that come together, they say, these are my qualifications, this is who I am, this is what I do, and then how do we move forward from where we are? How do we grow? You know, because we all have different ideas. Like it's like I said it earlier, it's very polarizing. And how do we find this middle ground? So without conversation, without breaking down barriers, removing expectations, I don't think it's easy to have a good sexual experience. So I can answer that. I would say in the past, it was, and this is probably, I can confidently say, something that a lot of younger men faced when you're sort of inexperienced and don't know how to approach it, and you've created these expectations for yourself in what you think the other gender is expecting from you, what you should do. And sometimes it might be so, maybe they have sort of expectations as well, or maybe they don't, like you don't know what someone else is thinking, right? So there's always this sort of like anxiety to perform. But until the point you get an experience where you meet somebody and the whole experience of sex changes, then those anxieties sort of like, you know, goes away. That monster in the closet, the boogeyman under your bed just disappears, and you feel like there's more to it than that. Like you're building a monster in your head and you're creating a room for it where it doesn't really need to exist. So yeah, if there's any younger guys watching out there, you know, it'll change. I think your perception of it will change, and that anxiety doesn't have to always continue existing. Yeah.
I have a follow-up question that isn't really part of this, and you can tell me how you feel about answering this. But I was having a conversation with him yesterday, I think, and we were talking about, I think, similarly, like insecurities. And something that he told me is that men, especially young men, tend to worry a lot about the size of their penis.
Yeah.
And that's something that for me, was very strange. I didn't know that was actually a thing that men experience. So is that a thing that will also be like anxiety inducing, you think?
I think it's just popular culture. You know, there's just all these. So here's the thing: any positive reinforcement you do, it's like, how do I put this? In popular culture, you hear people say all the time, or the size of his package or whatever, and they smile about it. So obviously, it's not like there's people. I mean, I'm sure there is, but the majority, in my perspective, the majority of the conversation in public is that big equals better.
Right, which isn't always the case.
Yeah. So if somebody, and it's, you know, it's not like people are walking naked around and you can like take, you know, rulers and measure each other. So unless there's a scientific study, what is considered average, like, varies a lot. And not only that, you know, there's other logistics in terms of elasticity, you know, that play a factor, to a point where it really doesn't matter what the size is, you know, unless you don't have a penis, which is a real problem now, or like, you know, I'm sure there's extremes where it's like a challenge, but for the most people, it's not going to be an issue. It's a non-issue, you know. But I think it's just media and culture that sort of created a framework.
And porn as well.
And porn as well, yeah, because, you know, it's a sort of small segment of people that are taking part in that, and they're carefully selected for like this factor or experience or wow factor to compete with these other videos on their platforms, you know. But yeah, I think for most people it shouldn't be a problem. It's just how you think about it. I think they differ a lot. I think they can almost be exclusive, you know. They can happen in the same realm, but you can have intimacy without even touching somebody. You know, like if I can define it, imagine, the way I say it is like, you know, the butterflies you get when you see somebody for the first time. Though it's ethereal, it's not grounded in anything. You see somebody across the room that you like and you make that eye contact and it makes you feel a certain way. That's a level of intimacy in a way, because you expressing an interest and a desire in that person, which is like an intimate thing. You know, you feel it's something that you wouldn't. You know, as a child, when people come up to you like, "Ooh, you like so and so," you feel like, "Why? I don't want them to know that," because it's an intimate thought inside you. But then to share that and have somebody reciprocate it is a form of intimacy in my books. That's how I see it. So, like, I think it's very possible to have intimacy without sex, but it's possible to have them together as well. Yeah. That's a tough one. I think, yeah, I'll speak from my experience. I think there's a level of, and this might contradict what I just said now that I think about it, because if you say, anyways, let me get to the point. If you're having sex with somebody, you always have to, there's always like an elephant in the room that sometimes comes in, and there's always certain thoughts that might sort of come in, unless you've sort of fortified yourself absolutely in your head to say that this is purely physical and there's nothing intimate about this. But then what I think, I'm no psychologist, right? But like what I think is that when you do that, when it comes to moments where you need to be intimate with somebody through sex, then it becomes, you have to jump from the other angle to a different sort of like worldview, right? Because if you want to have intimacy through sex, you can't then suddenly say, my brain, how I operate as a human being is gonna be without not having intimacy during sex. Like you can't have your cake and eat it too. So there are people that tend to easily bond or have intimacy through sex, and therefore for a person like that, it's going to be really hard to have casual sex, But for a person who's then decided, I'm just going to have multiple partners, or maybe not necessarily multiple partners, because it doesn't have to be multiple, but like to have sex on the regular for the reason of just pleasure and casually, then it's going to be hard for them to be in a state of intimacy during sex. Like they're going to have issues with that because you've made sex something else for you. You've defined it differently for yourself. So I think you really have, from my point of view, I think sex and intimacy should go together. I think it's much more beautiful that way, and I think you're robbing yourself of an experience for a watered down version of what it is if you're having casual sex. Yeah. So I think it's possible, but I don't think it's great. I think it's challenging. Sometimes you might feel lonely because you want that intimacy, but you've decided for yourself that it's a casual thing. And then when that happens, the person you're having sex with is like decided that it's casual, and then now it's like messy, and then you're like, oh, but it's just becomes a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think you should probably know what you're getting yourself into, and yeah, if the problems come, then it's a result of the choices you made. Mm-hmm. And it goes for both. Some people would say that, oh, it's only women that do it.
Yeah.
I think it's just women perhaps are more vocal about it, but I would say it's very possible to happen for both, male and female. So maybe let me start from a more polarizing point of view. Usually if you open extremes, it's easier to illustrate the argument, right? So in the West, like in the States and Europe and whatnot, there was like a conversation around consent meaning saying absolutely yes, So I think from a law point of view, it becomes really hard to dictate people's feelings, and it's. I think, in my opinion, this is what I think. I think consent is a feeling. Now, how do you communicate that feeling? Because you say, this is a person that I care about or I'm interested in, or however it is you frame, and I want to be intimate with them, right? Now, depending on the type of person you are, you might say, I want to be with this person, but I don't want to say yes, or I don't oppose a positive affirmation of this thing because either I might be easy or I might be putting out, or however it is you define it. And then this person on the other side, the guy, who probably might understand your point of view, maybe you haven't communicated it, but you sort of like meet at the same level, You don't tell them yes, but then you let them do it. And in your books, it's like, I consented to it, but you never said the word yes. And for the man, it's like they read the signs, but they were able to see through your communication logic. They're like, I know she wants this because she did this and did that. But it's a very thin line. It's like hard to sort of read. And whereas the flip side, you'd have, there's even scenarios where you see a woman would say no, and then later on she'd be like, but I gave you all the signals, like why did you not read that? But then there's also no where it's like no and you know it, right? So it's very murky, and so there's no one answer fits all, but I think in my opinion it goes back to communication. Like the way I approach it to avoid all that murkiness is that just talk about it, just be open. It might be weird or awkward or it doesn't feel right, but I guarantee if you have that conversation, you're saving yourself a lot of issues down the line, for both of you, men and women, And I think traditionally, because men are seen as the pursuers, and things are changing now, culture's evolving. I think from where we stand in a Tanzanian, African-centric point of view, that's somewhat still the predominant, ideology, at least how I perceive it. So therefore, men don't find themselves very often in the point of consent. Although there are instances where that would happen, where maybe it's a woman that's more sexually liberal, is okay with expressing what she wants. And it could be a scenario, maybe the guy is like, if I say no, what kind of guy would she think? If I don't want to have sex, am I gay or something? You can see that sort of conversation in some people's heads. And I think it's only because sex is sort of polarizing in a way, But I think the answer to it is have the conversation. And if I would say consent is probably a feeling, But how do you get that feeling across? Everybody sort of has a different way to do that. If you have the conversation, you don't have to have that ambiguity.
Yeah.
With my partner, I think comfortable. Yeah, I think it's important. It's important, and absolutely, I wasn't before, but you start bit by bit, and then it becomes a non-existing issue. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what makes it easier?
Just saying it,
Communication, as you say.
Yeah, there's a thought that comes to your mind, mm-hmm. an idea you want to explore, a thing that's happening that's not comfortable. Just push against that inertia that's in your mouth, that's stopping your mouth from opening. It might take a couple of days, maybe a few minutes, maybe a few seconds, who knows. Mm-hmm. But if you do it, I'm sure you won't regret it. And I think if anything, the assumption is that everything is meant to go right. Mm-hmm. And therefore if I say something and it causes it to go wrong, then therefore this is a problem, and then you internalize, and then I suck or something. It's not the case, If that conversation is uncomfortable, it's fine, because it's setting up a better foundation down the line.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I really like that you say that it's always assumed that it's meant to be easy, like an easy process, like a happy process, but things can go wrong even throughout the process, and it's quite okay to have those conversations, whether it's after or during or whenever you're comfortable with it. I really like that.
Yeah. And maybe just to add, I think when you're having the conversation, this is where, and not to get all tree hugger here, but this is where love becomes an important thing. I think if you care about another person, your delivery of the words and how you say and how you speak becomes totally different. Mm-hmm. It's not just about saying words, So if you care about another person, it's usually much easier. Mm.
That's true.
And if they care about you as well, not just you, It's not just you giving out. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I would say, so it depends, right? Not every sexual encounter is also going to be the same. Even within a relationship, I'm not saying with multiple partners, like in my case, there's going to be a scenario where it's just, we're tired and it's a quickie. Mm-hmm. There's going to be a scenario where, you're really being intimate. There's gonna be a scenario where it's more sexually fueled. It's a whole spectrum. It's a language, and sometimes you communicate differently, and sometimes you're in different spaces. So the expectations should be fluid because where each of you is at is gonna change. So to have, I think, one frame in which the sex should be, is sort of like setting yourself up for failure, because you're dictating the terms in which the two of you connect, and your partner isn't always going to be in the same space as you, and neither are you. I think, well, I did way back when I was younger, but it was one of those pleasure-seeking scenarios. You just don't know this person. You have these expectations set in your head, and the mind and the body are connected. So yeah, you come out having this bad experience, and you internalize that thinking that, I'm not good enough. But then when you're in a scenario where you're relaxed and you're there and you're connected, and it just changes entirely. So how you have sex has a lot to do, like how you're able to connect through sex and participate in sex has a lot to do with how you feel about the other person, what you're eating, how well you're sleeping. So many factors play in. Basically, your overall well-being, like not to be understated, and also your relationship with the person. If those things are not sitting properly, then you're more often likely to have an experience that's not good. It can lead to performance anxiety, it can lead to so many other things. Yeah.
I like that. I like overall well-being, because that is definitely like an important aspect of it. Like, obviously you may not have the connection with the person, but also if you're not there mentally, physically, emotionally, then obviously, the chances of you performing as you should, as you would like to perform are.
Yeah. It's just like working out. If you're running and you like doing 5K, one day you've had a bad day, you're gonna do 3K. So you're gonna have bad days and good days, and that's perfectly fine because you're human. Yeah.
Cool.
No, don't worry about how I look naked.
So this is interesting, because out of the men that I've interviewed, none of the men have said they have sexual insecurities. But when it comes to women, women tend to have sexual insecurity, which is very interesting to me. I'm yet to figure out why, but so far from the people that I've spoken to, it's very interesting that men just go in and they're fine. They don't really think that much about their bodies.
So I'd say this. I would encourage people to go listen to this song. It's called "I Don't Look Good Naked Anymore." It's a country song. I really love it. But he talks about how he's gotten older and his belly is hanging to the floor, and how when it's very jovial, it's very funny, it's very comedic, but I think it encapsulates the sort of like energy that most men who don't care about their body image carry. It's like, hey, look, I got a big belly, you just play around with it, Whereas I think with women and this is just my point of view, I feel like there's perhaps a social framework that they feel like they have to fit in and sort of maintain in terms of how they look and weight, Like very often I hear people, like women saying, oh, I don't want to get on the scale. To me, that doesn't make sense. And I'm saying, it's just a scale, it tells you what's there. Like, what difference does that make sense, I get why she feels the way she feels, but I don't feel the same way. I get the logic and where she's coming from, but I don't feel the same way. So I think it's just sort of like how society is structured. I think body image is a little bit different between the genders because of a society and sort of expectations set up for us. Yeah. In fact, there's like an opposite for men, particularly in the Tanzanian society, where it's like if you have like a kitambi and you're a little bit like in your late 30s and 40s, it means you got money. Like the value system is different. In fact, I think if you can distill it, there's a statement they say men age like wine. I think that's probably where it comes from. You've heard it, right?
I've heard it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's what I've heard from a few clinical psychologists and people that I've read and listened to that talk about the issue of the things that men need in women and women need in men at the core. Like for women, there's and it comes from nature. This is what they say. Like when a woman wants to have a family and she knows that she's going to have children and she, that's what she's chosen for herself, she needs somebody in that moment of her most vulnerability that will be able to be the support, right? And therefore that translates to usually, in many cases, like in the past before capitalism, it would be like maybe a stronger dude or whatever, better genetics for my kids to get this man who would be more capable in combating the elements, right? In our sense today, that translates to in a capitalistic sense, because I don't have to go fight a lion or, I don't know, get rid of bandits that are coming to our village, but it might mean maybe being able to build a home around us, or whatever the framework, whatever that means to you. And of course, the dynamics are changing, things are becoming a little bit different, but in essence, it's that those things translate to either stature, within the community, somebody maybe of a bit more renown, that's able to influence other people. And that tends to be people who are slightly older, because it takes time. You can't be young and then you say, I've accomplished all these things and I'm this and this person. So you find that the things that are sort of like valued for men tend to accrue over time. Whereas the things that men tend to value in women don't necessarily accrue over time. And in that case, it'd be like, many times you hear this all the time. You'll never hear, it's very rare to hear a guy, I want a woman who makes 6 figures or whatever. But that's, like, I say it like this, but for most people watching, it's you can hear somebody has said that at some point, and it was probably a woman. So it's almost as if, like, a rich guy could go and marry a waitress, and he'll be fine with his decision, totally happy with that. But then if a well-off woman goes and marries a bartender, then there's all these questions like, oh, what's happening here? It's like this framework in which our society has been structured. So it's like the things that men value with women don't necessarily get accrued with time. So it's like, and whereas the things that women value for men build up over time. So therefore, I think that the body image sort of like falls into that category as well, the idea of like youth and whatnot. But I think this is a very, in my opinion, very surface level of what relationships should be. Because at some point, the veil opens, and then you're left with this person for who they are. Regardless of how much money they have, or how big their booty is, or whatever it is, then you're left with you and them, and how they treat you, and how you treat them, and your kids, and all these other things that you perhaps didn't consider when you were choosing them, So it's a bit of a roundabout way to answer the question, but I think that's sort of like where body image comes. It's like we're a little bit different in the things we value. Yeah. I would say ideally yes, but I said ideally for a reason. I think within our context now, the cost of that would be that you'd be isolated from a lot of conversations. You'd be perceived in you'd bear a certain cross, if I put it that from a point of view. But if you're okay with that, then I think it's probably a good idea. Because what that does is it helps you remove those expectations. The expectations we talked about earlier, like if you have sex with lots of partners, you build an idea of what sex should be, and then you have to sort of like work back. When you meet somebody, let's say, has all the qualities, but then is missing something in the bedroom, or is not like this encounter that you had, you have to do the mental work to say, you know what, I accept this person for who they are, but if you were a virgin, then it's great anyways, And that's it sounds funny, but I'll tell you this. It's like people who were born in the 80s love their cassette recorders. They're not thinking about how hard it is to lug that around. But now you've got 1 million songs on your phone and you're still complaining about the algorithm. Like the human experience is very fluid and you can be happy anywhere. But it's like Pandora's box. Like once you open it, You can't close it. There's no going back. So there's sort of like a mitigation that you need to do around all the facts that you now have. Whereas in an ideal scenario, two people who have been virgins together, that love each other well, have a great experience together, and you'd be surprised, even though their experience might not be great to you from your standpoint, but they might be enjoying it way more than you are. It's like thrill seekers. When you're doing your first roller coaster ride, it's intense, but then there's people that are doing like, all sorts of diving and crazy exports, and it just never stops. It just keeps growing and growing because you get acclimatized, and then you need the next thing, and you get acclimatized, and then you need the next thing, So no,
Not at all?
no, sex was not discussed in my family. I think it was like a man and a woman kissed and then babies were born, And I guess it's as far as the Disney movies go. Excuse me. You just sort of figure it out on your own, I remember in was it Form 1, Form 2, this is like IB1, no, this is like GCSE, it's like second year, I think, something like that, for those one international schools. But there was a guy who had his first ejaculation, and this is around the time we should be taught. But we're all different slightly in how we hit puberty. So he came into the dorms and he was telling us his experience, like of how it happened, and he's talking about. He used the word mbegu, right? Because he's talking about semen. In my head, I thought there was actual seeds that were flowing through and coming out. So no, it's like I think my family never talked about it, and my perception of it was, whatever bits and pieces were just available to me. But then you learn, as you grow.
Okay, so follow-up question. I don't think I have a question that relates to this in any of the questions that follow up. How did you then learn about sex? Like, if you didn't learn about it from home, like what were your learning grounds?
I think so. It's a combination of things. I think till today you're still learning. It never stops. But obviously, for me, it was like the first actual seeing sex was through porn. Like I said earlier, it was a CD that was somewhere left around. Everybody left the house, and you're looking at the CD in your heart spacing. You put it in, you watch it. And then I think just conversations from people who have done it before you. Guys chilling around and somebody's trying to exert themselves as the alpha, like I did it first before everybody else. And then after that is just through experience. Yeah. And then I think experience, but also I think a lot of online research. I guess the older you get access to internet, you can Google anything now.
And I imagine it's probably easier for people our age because we had access to like internet and all of this stuff to get the information and knowledge that we wanted.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, without getting into lots of detail, I would say different people perceive sex differently because of their culture. Like, absolutely, that is not, in my experience, that's been the case. But I've learned to sort of, by having the conversation, you open up more possibilities and your perception changes. By having the conversation with your partner, you expand your horizons and you get to define for yourself what that is. So yeah, it did define for me at some point, but not so much. It's what me and my partner wanted to be. So I think it's perhaps maybe our children is the first place. Like I think sex needs to be sort of, I don't know, it might be my worldview. Maybe there's a different way to approach this that other people do. But I think our children is the first thing that makes us sort of take those conversations out of the public domain. But maybe the question would be, at what point do we start, and what should the conversation be? You know, we do have conversations in school, but they're very, very confined, and they're not quite constructive. I think and I think this fear is justified, in my opinion, like that young people could make irrational decisions around sex. And being a young person yourself, you know, whether it's me or you or anyone who's watching, knows that it's more likely to happen then than now. So I don't have an answer, to be honest, of how to do it, because I don't have kids, and I've never been with a kid that's gone through puberty, and how that should work. But I think society should ask itself real questions about when should we be having the conversations, and the pros and cons of having those conversations, because there's pros and cons on either side. Like, you can say, let's not have the conversations, but then the kids that are more, I would say, what's the word I'm looking for here? Are more courageous, would I say, or more explorative, would have no guidance. And I think I was talking to somebody recently who's working in development, and he's saying in our public schools it's a problem. You know, kids are having sex left, right, and center. And they're creating their own frameworks of how to interpret things based on what they're seeing on social media. And I think, in fact, I'm actually going to walk back on my point, just looking at it now, because I was looking at it from my framework. Right now, in terms of the access that our children have, in terms of the content that they're seeing, like, you got to get ahead of it and tell them what it's about before they decide what it is on their own terms. You know, it came from a point of trying to protect, but as societies have evolved, it's become a point of not equipping our kids. You know, so yeah, exactly at what age? I would say as soon as their body is creating the opportunity for them to have sex. Once they start thinking about it, once their hormones are kicking up, you know, we should definitely start telling them what it is, what the consequences are, having a proper conversation, not like, this is the uterus, and this is the penis, and the sperm goes inside. You know, like, leave that for the classroom, but we need another avenue of conversation. And if the parents are not doing it, then who's doing it? You know, I don't have the answer, but we need to have that dialogue. You know. I think that's a cultural thing. You mean in context of Tanzania, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I think our culture is very docile in terms of how we approach topics. Like, people cover things up. You know, it's like, when you know, just addressing people, looking at them in the eyes and saying things as they are. Like, we have to start there. You know, sex is like a layer after that. We can't address the subject of sex because we're afraid of conversations. We're afraid of saying things as they are. You know, I remember there's like particularly in the office, you can see this, when something goes wrong, or when people are not reaching, let's say, targets. It's just like, people would rather let the problem be ethereal than point the source. And it's not you're pointing the source that because, oh, this person sucked. Why can't we have the conversation and say, okay, you weren't able to do this, how can we help you get from where you are to elsewhere? But it's like, we're just afraid of pointing the finger. And sex really points the finger, you know, directly in your face. And it gives us this uncomfortable feeling. So I think when we need to create a culture of open conversation, and then that makes it easier for us to even speak to our kids about other issues, you know, about sex, about partners talking about finances, you know, saying that, oh, I earn this much to your wife, or your wife, I earn this much, you know. Like, simple things we can't communicate because we just have a culture of not saying things as they are, you know. And if we start there, it's going to make a huge difference, I think. Absolutely. I think, you know, falling back to the sort of like culture of the original kitchen parties and stuff, I remember, I mean, I've never attended any, but we all, as men, we know that we hear of the stories of like women being told exactly how to pleasure their man. But then there's never a conversation for men of how to pleasure their women, like a proper conversation. It's usually just guys saying, "Oh, I did it for 1 hour," and it's like, like that doesn't necessarily mean she is pleasured, So I think now, because we're coming out of that and the conversation's becoming more, even playing field, women are more able to say, how they feel. I definitely think that that's changing, you know.
Do you have any theories as to why this is changing?
Just more platforms to say things. Social media, people being more exposed, seeing other cultures doing things differently and being like, why can't we do that? Why do we have to take this approach? So we're leaving behind some of the old ideas.
I agree. I think also like connectedness in the sense that because of internet we're able to hear more stories, right? And relate to more stories more, and we could easily become other people by not become other people, but we could find new ways of existing by seeing how other people exist.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think I wish I had been taught that sex isn't all about pleasure, Yeah, I mean, you sort of know it, but I think as a child that's sort of like what's in your forefront. And maybe it's just hormones as well that are just pushing you in one direction. But I think very quickly in my first encounter, I sort of wasn't happy with what I did. I wasn't so happy with how I lost my virginity. It was just like, yeah. I didn't really know this person. I knew them by name. I hung out with them a couple of times, but yeah. Yeah, I think that's what I would have liked to know. And I think another thing would have been perhaps sort of the inevitable carnage that it leaves behind. With every, particularly for those people, say, who would go in a casual scenario, I don't think you're not going to come out clean. What you're negotiating is the level of, carnage that you're leaving. Might be a little bit, might be a lot, but something's going to happen. And for some people, they find out later than others, but yeah, I think those two things.
Okay.
The porn industry, if I could shut it down right now, I would.
Yeah?
To be honest. Because, first of all, it sets up wrong expectations. That's starting with the least of our problems. Second, it really, the thing about, having sex in a public forum, what it does to you as a person, we really understate that. There's a sense of, particularly in the West, I don't think we're there here yet. Things are still very much in the shadows, and I'm glad it's that way. I would love for it not to exist at all. But when you place yourself in a public forum like that, and you continue to have sex in that way, glorifying it in a casual way, I think it does something to you. It really does something to you, if you ask me. And I feel like you will never be able to go back to appreciate the intimacy and the beauty of it. That's one. But also, from a societal point of view, there's a lot of avenues then that become closed for you. Like options that are just out of the table. You can either maintain being a public figure with that sort of ghost sitting behind you, and also, like, I think the worldview that it's creating for young people is not accurate. I think that maybe goes back to my previous point. But also, I think there's another side that I don't know much about. But the question of consent and porn stars, and a lot of them are people who don't willingly choose it, but it's just like the money that you can get from it tends to be appealing, and it's one of those scenarios where you go into it thinking it's going to be a one-time thing, and then you realize it just keeps going and keeps going, and then you have to do more obscene things to earn more money, and then you get so far gone. Because I've listened to some stories of these people who have been in and out of it, the industry, and it's not great. You know, they're only going to show you what they want you to see, and also the numbers of people that are consuming it is absurd. You know, and another area as well is what it does to you physiologically. And I can't speak for women, but I know definitely for men, porn can be an addiction, you know? And I know it's more likely for men. Maybe it is for women, I don't know. But, and another thing is like, it literally physiologically changes how your brain is wired and how you respond to intimacy. You know, it has damage, you know. It's reversible. It takes time. You have to just stave off of it like any sort of addiction. The more you stop watching, the body reverts to its natural state. So, in my opinion, yeah, I think it's all out negatives if you ask me.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Ronnie. That's the end of our interview.
Well, thank you, Lydia, for having me.